Critique of Judgment by Immanuel Kant. Quotes. Critique of Judgment by Immanuel Kant is a profound exploration of aesthetics and teleology, representing the culmination of his critical philosophy. Originally published in 1790, this work aims to bridge the gap between the domains of theoretical reason, explored in his Critique of Pure Reason, and practical reason, as presented in his Critique of Practical Reason. The book delves into the nature of aesthetic judgment, how we evaluate beauty and the sublime, and teleological judgment, how we understand purpose in nature. Through these explorations, Kant articulates the concept of purposiveness, a key idea that connects nature to human faculties of judgment. The work challenges the reader to think beyond the empirical and rational, venturing into how subjective experience contributes to universal principles, thus uniting the sensuous and the moral under a common philosophical framework. Quote 1. A judgment of taste is not a cognitive judgment, and so is not a logical judgment, but an aesthetic one, by which we mean a judgment whose determining basis cannot be other than subjective. This quote establishes that judgments of taste, such as determining beauty, are based on subjective feelings rather than objective knowledge or logical reasoning. The basis for such judgments lies in individual experience and emotional response, not in the cognitive understanding of the object itself. Quote 2. Interest is what we call the liking. We connect with the presentation of an object's existence. This quote highlights the distinction between a pure aesthetic judgment and a judgment influenced by interest. An interest-driven judgment implies a desire for the object's existence, whereas in pure judgments of beauty, the liking is disinterested, focusing solely on the object's appearance without concern for its utility or existence. Quote 3. Everyone has to admit that if a judgment about beauty is mingled with the least interest, then it is very partial, and not a pure judgment of taste. Here, Kant emphasizes that a true judgment of taste must be entirely free from personal bias or interest. If personal desires or utilitarian considerations influence the judgment, it becomes partial, thus losing its purity and objectivity in terms of aesthetic evaluation. Quote 4. Good is what, by means of reason, we like through its mere concept. We call something good for this or that if we like it only as a means. This quote draws a distinction between what is good and what is beautiful. The concept of good is tied to rational evaluation and usefulness, where something is appreciated as a means to an end. In contrast, beauty does not require such rational considerations and can be appreciated independently of its purpose. Quote 5. Agreeable is what the senses like in sensation. This quote explains the notion of the agreeable, which is tied to sensory pleasure. Unlike beauty, which involves a more reflective form of liking, the agreeable refers to immediate sensory enjoyment. It suggests a more primal, direct connection to pleasure, which can be differentiated from judgments of taste that involve disinterest. Quote 6. A liking I have for the beautiful must depend on the reflection regarding an object that leads to some concept or other, but it is indeterminate which concept this is. Kant is explaining that the appreciation of beauty is based on a reflective process, but not necessarily tied to a specific concept. This differentiates beauty from the agreeable or the good, where specific concepts like sensory pleasure or rational purpose are involved. Quote 7. Only when their need has been satisfied can we tell who in a multitude of people has taste and who does not. This quote suggests that judgments of taste only become clear when free from necessity. When individuals are driven by basic needs or desires, their ability to make aesthetic judgments is compromised. True taste emerges only when one is free from such external pressures or biases. Quote 8. But if the question is whether something is beautiful, what we want to know is not whether we or anyone cares, or so much as might care in any way, about the thing's existence, but rather how we judge it in our mere contemplation of it, intuition or reflection. This quote emphasizes that the judgment of beauty is based solely on contemplation, without any concern for the object's practical existence or utility. The decision about whether something is beautiful arises from the act of perceiving it in a detached, reflective manner, independent of interest or need for the object. Quote 9. All he wants to know is whether my mere presentation of the object is accompanied by a liking, no matter how indifferent I may be about the existence of the object of this presentation. Here, Kant stresses that a judgment of taste is about the emotional response one has to the presentation of an object, not the object itself. The beauty lies in the subjective feeling it evokes, and this feeling is separate from any desire for the object to exist or any practical use it may have. Quote 10. A liking I have for the beautiful must depend on the reflection regarding an object that leads to some concept or other, but it is indeterminate which concept this is. Kant explains that appreciation for beauty arises from a reflective process in which the mind engages with the object, yet without necessarily arriving at a specific concept. This reflection is a free and undefined interaction, setting it apart from judgments of utility or practicality. Quote 11. For favor is the only free liking, neither an object of inclination, nor one that a law of reason enjoins on us as an object of desire, leaves us the freedom to make an object of pleasure for ourselves out of something or other. This quote distinguishes favor or disinterested liking as the only type of appreciation that is truly free. It stands apart from inclinations, which are tied to personal desires, and from objects deemed valuable by reason. True judgments of beauty involve this free and impartial kind of liking, which is not determined by practical concerns. Quote 12. We may say that of all these three kinds of liking, only the liking involved in taste for the beautiful is disinterested and free, since we are not compelled to give our approval by any interest, whether of sense or of reason. This passage highlights that judgments of taste, specifically regarding beauty, are the only ones that are truly free from external interests. Unlike the agreeable or the good, which involve the senses or reason, the aesthetic appreciation of beauty does not rely on any necessity or obligation, making it a uniquely free and disinterested form of judgment. Agreeableness, quote 13, holds for non-rational animals too. Beauty only for human beings, i.e., beings who are animal and yet rational. Kant notes that agreeableness is a type of pleasure that even animals experience, as it is tied to sensory satisfaction. However, beauty, which requires rational reflection, is an experience unique to human beings who possess both animal instincts and rational capacities. This sets beauty apart as a higher form of appreciation compared to simple sensory gratification. Quote 14. What we call beautiful is also liked directly. This statement underlines that beauty, like agreeableness, is something that evokes a direct liking. However, unlike the agreeable, which is tied to sensory pleasure, the liking for beauty is free from immediate practical concerns. It is an instinctive yet reflective form of appreciation, distinguishing it from other forms of pleasure that involve external interests. Quote 15. Beautiful is what, without a concept, is liked universally. This quote encapsulates Kant's idea that beauty is appreciated without the need for a specific concept or understanding. People can universally like something beautiful through an immediate emotional response, rather than through a rational or conceptual process. Beauty transcends individual preferences and is recognized through a shared human experience. Quote 16. Whenever a purpose is regarded as the basis of a liking, it always carries with it an interest, as the basis that determines the judgment about the object of the pleasure. Kant clarifies here that when a judgment is based on a purpose or usefulness, it becomes intertwined with personal interests and desires. Such a judgment is not purely aesthetic, but is instead influenced by the object's function or utility. thus lacking the disinterest necessary for a true judgment of taste. Quote 17. A pure judgment of taste is one that is not influenced by charm or emotion, and whose determining basis is therefore merely the purposiveness of the form. In this quote, Kant explains that a true judgment of beauty must be free from external influences such as charm or emotions. Instead, the evaluation is based solely on the form of the object and its inherent structure. This dispassionate assessment allows for an unbiased appreciation of beauty. Quote 18. Empirical aesthetic judgments are judgments of sense. Only pure aesthetic judgments are properly judgments of taste. This quote differentiates between judgments based on sensory pleasure and those based on pure aesthetic appreciation. While sensory judgments are tied to the physical pleasure derived from an object, pure judgments of taste are more profound and pertain to the contemplation of form, making them higher and more refined. Quote 19. All interest ruins a judgment of taste and deprives it of its impartiality. Kant asserts that any personal interest, whether emotional or practical, undermines the purity of a judgment of taste. Aesthetic judgments must be free from bias or external motivation to remain objective and impartial, focusing only on the intrinsic beauty of the object. Quote 20. Charm may be added to beauty as a supplement. They may offer the mind more than that dry liking, by also making the presentation of the object interesting. Kant acknowledges that while charm can enhance the aesthetic experience by adding liveliness or interest, it is only a supplementary aspect. Beauty, in its purest form, does not require charm to be appreciated. Charm should not be confused with beauty, but may serve to make an object more engaging. Quote 21. Objective purposiveness can be cognized only by referring the manifold to a determinate purpose, and hence through a concept. This quote explains that understanding the usefulness or purpose of an object requires the application of a concept. In contrast, beauty does not rely on such reasoning or conceptualization, as it is appreciated solely through its form and without reference to its function or purpose. Quote 22. A judgment of taste is based on nothing but the form of purposiveness of an object, or of the way of presenting it. This quote emphasizes that a pure judgment of taste concerns only the purposiveness of the form, meaning that the object is appreciated purely for its form, independent of any function or concept. It is an aesthetic response that doesn't rely on the object's utility or meaning, but rather on the way it appears and engages the senses. Quote 23. A judgment of taste, by which we declare an object beautiful, under the condition of a determinate concept, is not pure. Kant distinguishes here between pure and impure judgments of taste. When a judgment involves a concept or purpose related to the object, it is no longer purely aesthetic. The judgment is then constrained by preconceived ideas, making it less about the object's form and more about its function or symbolic meaning. Quote 24. Free beauty does not presuppose a concept of what the object is meant to be. This quote highlights that free beauty, such as the beauty of flowers or birds, is appreciated without the need for any concept or purpose. Free beauty is judged solely on its form, without the viewer needing to understand or apply any concept about the object's function or role. Quote 25. The beauty of a human being, or the beauty of a horse or a building, presupposes the concept of the purpose that determines what the thing is meant to be. Kant contrasts free beauty with accessory beauty, such as the beauty of humans, animals, or buildings, which is tied to an understanding of their purpose. In such cases, the judgment of beauty is influenced by how well the object fulfills its purpose, meaning the appreciation is not purely aesthetic, but also intellectual. Quote 26. A liking for beauty is one that presupposes no concept, but is directly connected with the presentation by which the object is given. This quote reiterates that true aesthetic pleasure in beauty comes from an immediate, unmediated response to the object. It is a direct experience of beauty that does not require rationalization or the application of concepts to understand or justify the judgment. Quote 27. Neither does perfection gain by beauty, nor beauty by perfection. Kant argues that while beauty and perfection are related, they are distinct qualities. Beauty is appreciated without the need for perfection, which is tied to a concept of purpose. Perfection relates to how well something fulfills its intended role, but beauty can be enjoyed independently of whether the object is perfect in its function. Quote 28. There can be no objective rule of taste, no rule of taste that determines by concepts what is beautiful. Kant asserts that judgments of beauty cannot be determined by fixed objective rules. Since beauty is an aesthetic experience based on subjective feelings, there is no universal criterion or concept that can define beauty for everyone. Each individual must experience and judge beauty based on their own feelings and perception. Quote 29. But we think of the beautiful as having a necessary reference to liking. This quote explains that beauty, unlike something merely agreeable, is thought to have an essential connection to our sense of pleasure. When we encounter something beautiful, we feel as though it should universally evoke pleasure, suggesting that beauty has a necessary quality that commands a shared response. Quote 30. A judgment of taste requires everyone to assent, and whoever declares something to be beautiful holds that everyone ought to give his approval to the object at hand, and that he, too, should declare it beautiful. Here, Kant asserts that when we judge something as beautiful, we feel that others should agree with our judgment. Beauty demands universal assent, not because of objective reasoning, but because we assume there is a shared basis for aesthetic judgment that applies to all. Quote 31. Only under the presupposition of such a common sense, I maintain, can judgments of taste be made. Kant introduces the idea of a common sense, meaning a shared aesthetic capacity among individuals. Judgments of taste, which claim universal validity, rely on this assumed common sensibility. Without it, we could not expect others to agree with our assessments of beauty. Quote 32. Whenever we make a judgment declaring something to be beautiful, we permit no one to hold a different opinion, even though we base our judgment only on our feeling rather than on concepts. This quote highlights that judgments of beauty, although subjective and based on personal feeling, carry an implicit demand for universal agreement. We assert our judgments as if they were objective, even though they stem from individual experiences of pleasure. Quote 33. Beautiful is what without a concept is cognized as the object of a necessary liking. Kant defines beauty as something that we find pleasing without needing to understand it conceptually. Beauty appeals directly to our senses and imagination, creating a necessary feeling of pleasure, independent of any intellectual explanation. Quote 34. It seems, therefore, that only a lawfulness without a law and a subjective harmony of the imagination with the understanding without an objective harmony is compatible with the free lawfulness of the understanding and with the peculiarity of a judgment of taste. Kant describes aesthetic judgments as arising from a harmonious interaction between imagination and understanding, which occurs without the constraints of objective rules. This lawfulness without a law captures the essence of free, subjective aesthetic experience, where beauty is judged without rigid standards or concepts. Quote 35. Everything that shows stiff regularity runs counter to taste because it does not allow us to be entertained for long by our contemplation of it. Instead, it bores us. This quote suggests that rigid, predictable forms fail to sustain our interest because they lack the dynamic, free play of the imagination that characterizes true beauty. Regularity, while useful for practical purposes, limits aesthetic engagement, making it less enjoyable to contemplate. Quote 36. The beautiful and the sublime are similar in some respects. We like both for their own sake, and both presuppose that we make a judgment of reflection rather than either a judgment of sense or a logically determinative one. This quote highlights the common ground between beauty and the sublime. Both are appreciated independently, without any practical or logical basis. Their appeal is rooted in reflective judgment, where the mind contemplates the experience rather than relying on sensory pleasure or intellectual concepts. Both involve a personal, introspective process that results in a universal sense of liking. Quote 37. The sublime can also be found in a formless object, insofar as we present unboundedness, either in the object or because the object prompts us to present it, while yet we add to this unboundedness the thought of its totality. Kant differentiates the sublime from the beautiful by focusing on the sublime's association with formlessness and boundlessness. The experience of the sublime comes from contemplating something vast or overwhelming, something that stretches beyond our comprehension, but which we still attempt to conceptualize as a whole. This tension between unboundedness and totality creates the feeling of the sublime. Quote 38. The feeling of the sublime is a pleasure that arises only indirectly. It is produced by the feeling of a momentary inhibition of the vital forces followed immediately by an outpouring of them that is all the stronger. Kant describes the experience of the sublime as one that initially overwhelms and restrains our faculties, but then releases them with increased intensity. This combination of inhibition and subsequent release generates a unique form of pleasure, distinct from the direct pleasure found in beauty. The sublime evokes a sense of awe and respect, rather than simple delight. Quote 39. On the other hand, if something arouses in us, merely in apprehension and without any reasoning on our part, a feeling of the sublime, then it may indeed appear, in its form, contrapurposive for our power of judgment, incommensurate with our power of exhibition, and as it were violent to our imagination. Here, Kant explains that objects that evoke the sublime often seem disproportionate or chaotic, challenging our ability to grasp them. This creates a sense of tension and discomfort for the imagination, which cannot easily reconcile the object's form with our usual ways of understanding the world. Yet, this very quality elevates the object in our judgment, leading us to view it as sublime. Quote 40. What is sublime, in the proper meaning of the term, cannot be contained in any sensible form, but concerns only ideas of reason, which, though they cannot be exhibited adequately, are aroused and called to mind by this very inadequacy. Kant emphasizes that the sublime transcends the sensory realm. It is not about the form of the object itself, but about the ideas that it evokes within us. These ideas, linked to reason, cannot be fully captured through the senses, but the experience of the sublime triggers our awareness of them through the inadequacy of our sensory perception. Quote 41. For the beautiful in nature, we must seek a basis outside ourselves, but for the sublime, a basis merely within ourselves, and in the way of thinking that introduces sublimity into our presentation of nature. Kant contrasts beauty and the sublime in their relationship to the self. Beauty is something we find in the external world, in the form and harmony of nature or art. The sublime, however, originates within us. It arises from our internal response to the vastness or power of nature, reflecting our own capacity for thought and reason rather than something inherent in the object itself. Quote 42. We must divide the sublime into the mathematically and the dynamically sublime. This quote introduces Kant's division of the sublime into two categories: the mathematical sublime, which deals with vastness and the unbounded, and the dynamic sublime, which involves power and might. Both evoke feelings of the sublime, but do so in different ways, one through the contemplation of sheer size, and the other through the perception of overwhelming forces. Quote 43. We call sublime what is absolutely large. Kant introduces the concept of the sublime by describing it as something absolutely large, beyond comparison. Unlike beauty, which can be judged based on form, the sublime is related to vastness and immensity that cannot be compared or easily measured, existing beyond normal standards of magnitude. Quote 44. This liking is by no means a liking for the object, since that may be formless, but rather a liking for the expansion of the imagination itself. In this passage, Kant explains that the pleasure derived from the sublime is not based on the object's form or structure. Instead, the pleasure comes from the way the sublime experience pushes the imagination beyond its usual boundaries, expanding our cognitive capacities. Quote 45. Sublime is what, even to be able to think, proves that the mind has a power surpassing any standard of sense. Kant highlights that the sublime is a reflection of the mind's capacity to grasp ideas that go beyond sensory experience. The very act of contemplating something sublime, such as infinite magnitude, demonstrates the mind's ability to transcend the limitations of sense perception and engage with abstract, boundless concepts. Quote 46. Nothing that can be an object of the senses is to be called sublime. Kant asserts that objects of the senses, regardless of how large or powerful they may appear, cannot truly be sublime. The sublime is not inherent in the object itself, but is a product of the mind's response to it, particularly when the imagination reaches its limits and triggers an awareness of the supersensible. Quote 47. When apprehension has reached the point where the partial presentations of sensible intuition that were first apprehended are already beginning to be extinguished in the imagination, there is a maximum in comprehension that it cannot exceed. This quote describes the limitations of the imagination when it attempts to comprehend something of immense magnitude. As the mind tries to take in the whole, parts of the object are lost before others are fully grasped, leading to a feeling of incompleteness and signaling the mind's inability to comprehend the totality. Quote 48. An object is monstrous if by its magnitude it nullifies the purpose that constitutes its concept. Kant defines the monstrous as something whose size or scale undermines its very purpose. When an object's magnitude becomes so overwhelming that it disrupts the concept it is meant to represent, it is no longer just large but monstrous, highlighting the limits of comprehension. Quote 49. A pure judgment about the sublime, on the other hand, must have no purpose whatsoever of the object as the basis determining it, if it is to be aesthetic and not mingled with some judgment of understanding or of reason. Kant emphasizes that a pure judgment of the sublime should not be influenced by any practical or rational purpose associated with the object. It must arise solely from the aesthetic experience, free from intellectual concepts or utility, allowing the mind to focus on the vastness and power that evoke the sublime. Quote 50. Reason demands comprehension in one intuition, and exhibition of all the members of a progressively increasing numerical series, and it exempts from this demand not even the infinite, space and past time. This quote describes the nature of reason's demand for completeness, even when contemplating something infinite, such as space or time. The human mind is compelled to grasp totality, even though this is impossible within the limits of sensory perception. This tension between what reason demands and what the senses can provide is central to the experience of the mathematically sublime. Quote 51. But our imagination, even in its greatest effort to do what is demanded of it and comprehend a given object in a whole of intuition, proves its own limits and inadequacy, and yet at the same time proves its vocation to a law, namely, to make itself adequate to that idea. Here, Kant explains that the imagination inevitably fails when it tries to encompass the vastness demanded by reason. But in this failure, the imagination reveals its true purpose, to align itself with the higher demands of reason. This paradox of inadequacy, yet striving for adequacy, evokes the sublime feeling of both limitation and transcendence. Quote 52. Nature is sublime in those of its appearances whose intuition carries with it the idea of their infinity. Kant states that the sublime is experienced in nature when we encounter something that evokes the concept of infinity, such as the vastness of the ocean or the night sky. These experiences transcend our sensory capacity and force us to acknowledge the infinite, which cannot be fully comprehended by our minds. Quote 53. The sublime lies not so much in the magnitude of the number as in the fact that, the farther we progress, the larger are the unities we reach. Kant observes that the sublime is not merely about encountering vast quantities, but about the progression toward ever larger scales. As we expand our understanding of magnitude, we recognize the unending scale of the universe, which contributes to the feeling of the sublime. Quote 54. The feeling of the sublime is a feeling of displeasure that arises from the imagination's inadequacy, but is at the same time also a pleasure, aroused by the fact that this very judgment is in harmony with rational ideas. This quote explains the dual nature of the sublime experience. The imagination's failure to fully comprehend vast magnitudes leads to a feeling of displeasure. However, this displeasure transforms into pleasure when we realize that this failure aligns with reason's ideas, which seek something greater than what the senses can provide. Quote 55. This agitation, above all at its inception, can be compared with a vibration, i.e., with a rapid alternation of repulsion from and attraction to one and the same object. Kant describes the emotional experience of the sublime as a kind of mental vibration, where the mind feels both attracted and repelled by the object at the same time. This oscillation between awe and fear is central to the feeling of the sublime, which balances these contrasting emotions. Quote 56. Nature offers examples of the mathematically sublime, in mere intuition, whenever our imagination is given a large unity for a measure. Kant explains that the mathematically sublime in nature occurs when we encounter immense objects or systems, such as mountains or galaxies, that provide us with a large standard for measurement. These vast unities challenge the imagination's capacity to comprehend them, leading to a sublime experience. Quote 57. When in an aesthetic judgment we consider nature as a might that has no dominance over us, then it is dynamically sublime. This quote defines the dynamically sublime, which occurs when we confront nature's overwhelming power, but recognize that it does not have true control over us. This recognition allows us to admire the might of nature from a position of safety, leading to a sublime experience. Quote 58. Compared to the might of any of these, our ability to resist becomes an insignificant trifle. Yet the sight of them becomes all the more attractive the more fearful it is, provided we are in a safe place. Kant explains that nature's most terrifying displays of power, like storms or waterfalls, make us aware of our physical vulnerability. However, as long as we are safe, these same scenes become deeply attractive, as they stimulate our imagination and emotions, bringing forth a sense of sublimity. Quote 59. We found, in our power of reason, a different and nonsensible standard that has this infinity itself under it as a unit. We found in our mind a superiority over nature itself in its immensity. Kant suggests that even though nature may seem limitless and overwhelming, our capacity for reason enables us to feel superior to nature. Reason allows us to grasp concepts like infinity, placing them under a framework of thought that surpasses the limits of nature. Quote 60. Nature is here called sublime merely because it elevates our imagination, making it exhibit those cases where the mind can come to feel its own sublimity, which lies in its vocation, and elevates it even above nature. Kant states that nature's sublimity lies in how it elevates our imagination and mind, helping us realize our own inner strength and sublimity. Through this experience, we perceive ourselves as superior to nature, not physically, but through our rational and moral capacities. Sublimity, quote 61, is contained not in anything of nature, but only in our mind. insofar as we can become conscious of our superiority to nature within us, and thereby also to nature outside us. Kant clarifies that the true source of sublimity is not in nature itself, but in the human mind. The sublime arises from our awareness of our superiority over nature, both internally and externally, as we recognize our rational and moral capacities that transcend the natural world. Quote 62. A liking for the sublime in nature is only negative. It is a feeling that the imagination by its own action is depriving itself of its freedom, in being determined purposively according to a law different from that of its empirical use. This passage explains that the pleasure of the sublime is paradoxical and negative. The imagination feels constrained as it tries to grasp vast or powerful natural phenomena, but in doing so, it aligns itself with reason, surpassing the bounds of mere sensory experience. Quote 63. In this way, we feel our superiority to nature within ourselves, and hence also to nature outside us, insofar as it can influence our feeling of well-being. Kant concludes that the sublime experience helps us recognize our independence from natural influences. By contemplating the vastness or might of nature, we reaffirm our inner strength and rationality, which makes us feel superior to the external forces that might otherwise seem overwhelming. Quote 64. When we call the sight of the starry sky sublime, we must not base our judgment upon any concepts of worlds that are inhabited by rational beings, but we must base our judgment regarding it merely on how we see it, as a vast vault encompassing everything. This quote emphasizes that the sublime judgment should not rely on intellectual concepts or knowledge about the stars and their scientific purpose. Instead, the sublimity lies in the pure visual experience of the vastness and magnitude of the starry sky, which evokes awe without any rational consideration. Quote 65. We found in our mind a superiority over nature itself in its immensity, revealing in us a superiority over nature that is the basis of a self-preservation quite different in kind from the one that can be assailed and endangered by nature outside us. Kant explains that through the sublime experience, we discover a sense of superiority within our minds. Although nature may overpower us physically, we recognize that our reason and moral capacity place us above nature in a more profound spiritual sense, ensuring a form of preservation that nature cannot threaten. Quote 66. Hence, sublimity is contained not in anything of nature, but only in our mind, insofar as we can become conscious of our superiority to nature within us, and thereby also to nature outside us. This quote highlights that the experience of the sublime is not found in nature itself, but in the human mind. It arises from our ability to recognize our superiority to nature, both internally, in our reason, and externally, in our ability to transcend physical limitations through thought. Quote 67. It follows from this that if we judge aesthetically the good that is intellectual and intrinsically purposive, the moral good, we must present it not so much as beautiful, but rather as sublime. Kant distinguishes between beauty and sublimity in the context of morality. Moral goodness, which aligns with intellectual and purposeful action, is better understood as sublime rather than beautiful because it involves a sense of respect and elevation beyond mere aesthetic pleasure. Quote 68. Enthusiasm is sublime aesthetically because it is a straining of our forces by ideas that impart to the mind a momentum whose effects are mightier and more permanent than are those of an impulse produced by presentations of sense. Kant describes enthusiasm as an emotional state that is aesthetically sublime, because it arises from ideas that inspire a powerful and lasting momentum in the mind. This momentum, driven by ideas rather than sensory experience, makes enthusiasm a sublime force. Quote 69. Every affect of the vigorous kind is aesthetically sublime, e.g., anger, even desperation, provided it is indignant rather than despondent desperation. Kant argues that strong emotions like anger or desperation, when they involve a sense of resistance and fortitude, can be considered sublime. These emotions reveal the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity, making them aesthetically powerful and elevating. Quote 70. The sublime must always have reference to our way of thinking, i.e., to maxims directed to providing the intellectual side in us and our rational ideas with supremacy over sensibility. Kant concludes that the sublime is fundamentally about our intellectual and moral faculties. The sublime experience reflects the supremacy of reason and rational ideas over mere sensory experience, revealing our higher nature and intellectual capacities. Quote 71. Since an aesthetic judgment lays claim to universal validity for every subject, and hence must be based on some a priori principle or other, it requires a deduction, i.e., a legitimation of its pretension. This quote underscores the necessity of providing a justification for aesthetic judgments, particularly judgments of taste. Because these judgments claim to have universal validity, they must be grounded in an a priori principle that explains why such a claim can be made, even though they are subjective. Quote 72. When we speak of the sublime in nature, we speak improperly. Properly speaking, sublimity can be attributed merely to our way of thinking. Kant clarifies that sublimity is not an inherent quality of nature, but is instead a product of our mental response to certain natural phenomena. Sublime experiences arise from the way our minds react to vast, overwhelming objects, rather than from any intrinsic properties those objects possess. Quote 73. A judgment of taste consists precisely in this, that it calls a thing beautiful only by virtue of that characteristic, in which it adapts itself to the way we apprehend it. This passage explains that beauty is not a property of an object itself, but rather a reflection of how the object aligns with the way we perceive and judge it. Beauty exists in the relationship between the object and our capacity to appreciate it aesthetically. Quote 74. Taste lays claim merely to autonomy, but to make other people's judgments the basis determining one's own would be heteronomy. Kant emphasizes the autonomy of taste, meaning that judgments of beauty or taste must be based on one's own subjective response rather than being influenced by others. Relying on others' judgments would undermine the independence of one's aesthetic evaluation, turning it into heteronomy. Quote 75. If others make a judgment that is unfavorable to us, this may rightly make us wonder about our own judgment, but it can never convince us that ours is incorrect. Kant explains that while other people's opinions may cause us to reflect on or question our aesthetic judgments, they cannot serve as definitive proof that our judgment is wrong. Aesthetic judgments are subjective, and no external validation can replace personal experience. Quote 76. Hence, there is no empirical basis of proof that could compel anyone to make a judgment of taste. This quote reinforces the idea that judgments of taste cannot be determined by empirical evidence or external rules. Each individual must experience and evaluate beauty directly through personal perception, and no logical argument can force someone to change their aesthetic preferences. Quote 77. That I am perceiving and judging an object with pleasure is an empirical judgment, but that I find the object beautiful, i.e., that I am entitled to require that liking from everyone as necessary, is an a priori judgment. Kant distinguishes between personal pleasure and judgments of beauty. While experiencing pleasure from an object is empirical and subjective, claiming that the object is beautiful and should be appreciated by everyone requires an a priori judgment, meaning it appeals to a universal principle beyond personal experience. Quote 78. If it is granted that, in a pure judgment of taste, our liking for the object is connected with our mere judging of the form of the object, then this liking is nothing but our consciousness of the form's subjective purposiveness for the power of judgment. This quote explains that in a pure judgment of taste, our liking for an object is derived solely from how its form appeals to our cognitive faculties. The pleasure we experience comes from recognizing a subjective harmony between the form of the object and the way we judge it, rather than from any external purpose or concept. Quote 79. Beauty is not a concept of an object, and a judgment of taste is not a cognitive judgment. Kant emphasizes that beauty is not an objective property that can be conceptually understood. Instead, beauty is a subjective experience, and judgments of taste do not rely on cognition, but rather on the personal aesthetic response to an object, which is felt rather than understood intellectually. Quote 80. All it asserts is that we are justified in presupposing universally in all people the same subjective conditions of the power of judgment that we find in ourselves. This quote highlights the universal claim of judgments of taste. Even though these judgments are based on subjective feelings, we assume that others share the same cognitive faculties, which allows us to expect that they will agree with our assessment of beauty. Quote 81. A judgment of taste determines its object in respect of our liking, beauty, but makes a claim to everyone's assent, as if it were an objective judgment. Kant describes the paradox of judgments of taste. Although they are subjective, they still claim universal agreement. When we judge something as beautiful, we believe that others should also find it beautiful, despite the subjective nature of the judgment. Quote 82. Only a judgment by which I find a singular given tulip beautiful, i.e., in which I find that my liking for the tulip is universally valid, is a judgment of taste. This quote illustrates that a true judgment of taste is made when we judge a specific object, like a tulip, as beautiful, and expect that this appreciation is universally valid. It is not enough to declare that all tulips are beautiful in general. The judgment must arise from a direct, singular experience. Quote 83. If someone does not find a building, a view, or a poem beautiful, he will refuse to let even 100 voices, all praising it highly, prod him into approving of it inwardly. Kant emphasizes that judgments of taste are deeply personal and cannot be swayed by the opinions of others. Even if many people praise something as beautiful, an individual's own aesthetic judgment cannot be altered by external validation. Quote 84. The pleasure we take in the beautiful is a pleasure neither of enjoyment, nor of a law-governed activity, nor yet of a reasoning contemplation governed by ideas, but is a pleasure of mere reflection. This quote defines the nature of aesthetic pleasure. Unlike other forms of pleasure that may be derived from sensory enjoyment, duty, or intellectual contemplation, the pleasure we experience in beauty arises purely from reflection on the form of the object and how it stimulates our cognitive faculties. Quote 85. In order for us to be able to take a direct interest in the beautiful as such, it must be nature, or we must consider it so. Kant explains that for humans to feel a direct, genuine interest in beauty, the object must be perceived as a part of nature. The appreciation for beauty diminishes when we discover that it is an artificial creation, revealing our deep connection to the authenticity of natural beauty over the deception of artifice. Quote 86. We consider someone's way of thinking to be coarse and ignoble if he has no feeling for beautiful nature and sticks to the enjoyments of mere sense that he gets from meals or the bottle. This quote emphasizes the importance of having an appreciation for natural beauty as a mark of a refined and elevated mind. Those who focus only on sensory pleasures such as food and drink are seen as lacking in taste and sensitivity toward higher forms of aesthetic appreciation. Quote 87. Art always has a determinate intention to produce something, but if this something were mere sensation, to be accompanied by pleasure, then we would like this product in judging it, only by means of the feeling of sense. Kant points out the distinction between art that simply stimulates the senses for immediate pleasure and fine art, which engages our reflective judgment. Art that produces mere sensation is judged through sensory pleasure, whereas fine art stimulates deeper aesthetic reflection. Quote 88. Even though the purposiveness in a product of fine art is intentional, it must still not seem intentional, i.e., fine art must have the look of nature, even though we are conscious of it as art. This quote explains that fine art should not reveal the effort or intention behind its creation. Instead, it should appear as natural and effortless, even though it is the result of careful artistic planning. The illusion of spontaneity is key to the aesthetic success of fine art. Quote 89. Genius is a talent for producing something for which no determinate rule can be given. The foremost property of genius must be originality. Kant defines genius as the ability to create something new and original, which cannot be replicated by following established rules. This creative power is a gift of nature and distinguishes true genius from mere skill or learned ability. Quote 90. Genius itself cannot describe or indicate scientifically how it brings about its products, and it is rather as nature that it gives the rule. This quote highlights that a genius cannot fully explain how they create their works, as their creativity operates like nature, intuitive and spontaneous, rather than methodical or teachable. This natural, unexplainable talent is what sets genius apart from learned abilities. Quote 91. The art of sculpture, too, has excluded from its creations any direct presentation of ugly objects. Instead, it has permitted ugly objects to be presented by an allegory. Kant explains that sculpture, as a fine art, avoids directly representing ugly or repulsive objects. Instead, it uses allegory to present such themes in a way that aligns with aesthetic ideals, preserving the beauty of the artwork while still conveying deeper meanings through symbolic representation. Quote 92. An aesthetic idea is a presentation of the imagination which prompts much thought, but to which no determinate thought whatsoever, i.e., no determinate concept, can be adequate, so that no language can express it completely and allow us to grasp it. This quote defines an aesthetic idea as a creative product of the imagination that evokes extensive thought, yet resists being fully captured by any concept or language. The power of an aesthetic idea lies in its ability to inspire endless reflection, transcending the limits of clear conceptual understanding. Quote 93. For the imagination is very mighty when it creates, as it were, another nature out of the material that actual nature gives it. Kant explains that the imagination possesses a powerful creative ability. It takes the material provided by nature and transforms it into something entirely new, effectively generating a parallel reality that surpasses what nature itself presents. Quote 94. The great king, in one of his poems, expresses himself thus: "Let us part from life without grumbling or regrets, leaving the world behind filled with our good deeds." This quote illustrates how aesthetic ideas can be embodied in poetry, where the language goes beyond mere expression and conjures deep, reflective emotions. The poet's words evoke an idealized image of parting from life, one that invites the reader to contemplate broader philosophical ideas about legacy and virtue. Quote 95. An aesthetic idea is a presentation that makes us add to a concept the thoughts of much that is ineffable, but the feeling of which quickens our cognitive powers and connects language, which otherwise would be mere letters, with spirit. Here, Kant explains how aesthetic ideas transcend ordinary thought. They stimulate our cognitive faculties by making us think beyond the bounds of the concept itself, adding layers of meaning that can't be expressed fully in words, yet are felt deeply and enrich our understanding. Quote 96. Genius actually consists in the happy relation, one that no science can teach and that cannot be learned by any diligence, allowing us, first, to discover ideas for a given concept, and second, to hit upon a way of expressing these ideas. Kant defines genius as an innate talent that cannot be taught or acquired through effort. It involves both the ability to generate original ideas and the unique skill to express those ideas in a way that inspires others, making it a rare and exceptional quality. Quote 97. The product of a genius is an example that is meant not to be imitated, but to be followed by another genius. This quote emphasizes that works of genius are not meant to be copied. Instead, they serve as inspiration for other geniuses, encouraging them to create original works of their own, thus preserving the spirit of creativity and innovation without simply replicating what has already been done. Quote 98. A certain boldness of expression, and in general some deviation from the common rule, is entirely fitting for a genius. It is, however, not at all worthy of imitation. Kant suggests that geniuses often break conventional rules in their works, demonstrating boldness and originality. However, this boldness is specific to their creative process and should not be imitated by others, as it is the unique spirit of the genius that justifies such deviations from the norm. Quote 99. Among all the arts, poetry holds the highest rank. It owes its origin almost entirely to genius and is least open to guidance by precept or examples. Kant considers poetry to be the most elevated of the arts because it arises primarily from the genius of the artist and is less constrained by rules or prior examples. Poetry embodies creativity in its purest form, offering freedom to the imagination and allowing for an expression that transcends rigid guidelines. Quote 100. The pleasure we take in purposive form is also culture, and it attunes the spirit to ideas, and so makes it receptive to more such pleasure and entertainment. This quote explains that the enjoyment we derive from forms that appear purposive, such as those in art, not only provides aesthetic pleasure but also contributes to our intellectual and cultural development. It prepares the mind to appreciate higher forms of pleasure connected to ideas and deeper reflection. Quote 101. Poetry plays with illusion, which it produces at will, and yet without using illusion to deceive us, for poetry tells us itself that its pursuit is mere play. Kant describes poetry as an art that skillfully creates illusions, yet does so transparently, without intending to deceive. The power of poetry lies in its ability to engage the imagination freely, while making it clear to the audience that it is a playful, creative act, rather than a representation of reality. Quote 102. Music, since it merely plays with sensations, has the lowest place among the fine arts. Yet it may have the highest among those whose value we assess by their agreeableness. Kant places music lower on the hierarchy of the fine arts because it primarily engages the senses and does not contribute as much to intellectual culture. However, he acknowledges that music excels when evaluated based on its capacity to produce pleasure and enjoyment, making it highly agreeable. Quote 103. The visual arts carry on a task at the same time. They bring about a product that serves the concepts of the understanding as an enduring vehicle. Here, Kant highlights the value of visual arts like painting and sculpture, which not only engage the senses, but also serve intellectual purposes by providing lasting impressions. These arts offer a tangible product that aligns with concepts and can be appreciated over time, contributing to both aesthetic and intellectual experiences. Quote 104. Music proceeds from sensations to indeterminate ideas, the visual arts from determinate ideas to sensations. Kant contrasts music and visual arts in terms of their approach to ideas. Music begins with sensory experiences that give rise to vague ideas, while visual arts start with clear, defined ideas and then translate them into sensory forms. This distinction reflects the different ways these arts engage the imagination and understanding. Quote 105. For if we assume that all our thoughts are in addition in a harmonious connection with some agitation in the body's organs, then we can pretty well grasp how there might be a corresponding alternating tension and relaxation of the elastic parts of our intestines. Kant speculates on the physical effects of laughter, suggesting that it results from a harmonious interaction between thoughts and bodily sensations. Laughter involves a physical release of tension, which he argues is beneficial for health, as the body responds to the playful shifting of thoughts in the mind. Quote 106. There is no disputing about taste. That amounts to saying that, even though the basis determining a judgment of taste may be objective, that basis still cannot be brought to determinate concepts. Kant explains that while judgments of taste may be objective in their nature, they cannot be proven or resolved through logic or determinate concepts. Therefore, we cannot dispute or prove aesthetic judgments, even though we may engage in discussions or quarrels about them, recognizing the subjective element in the aesthetic experience. Quote 107. A judgment of taste is not based on concepts, for otherwise one could dispute about it, decide by means of proofs. This quote asserts that judgments of taste are not based on concrete, objective concepts that can be measured or proven. If such judgments were grounded in concepts, they could be resolved through logical dispute, which contradicts the nature of aesthetic judgments, which rely on subjective feeling and reflection. Quote 108. A judgment of taste is based on concepts, for otherwise, regardless of the variation among such judgments, one could not even so much as quarrel about them. Kant presents the counter-argument that judgments of taste must involve some form of concept, as they claim a kind of universal validity. Without a conceptual basis, there would be no grounds for expecting others to agree with our judgments, or for engaging in aesthetic discussions, which implies that some form of shared understanding is involved. Quote 109. A judgment of taste must refer to some concept or other, for otherwise it could not possibly lay claim to necessary validity for everyone. This quote emphasizes that judgments of taste, while subjective, implicitly claim universal validity. This claim requires some conceptual basis, even though the concept in question may remain indeterminate, and cannot be fully defined or proven, allowing for a broader, shared experience of beauty. Quote 110. A judgment of taste is based on a concept, the concept of a general basis of nature's subjective purposiveness for our power of judgment. But this concept does not allow us to cognize and prove anything concerning the object. Kant clarifies that the concept underlying judgments of taste is one of nature's purposiveness, meaning that objects appear designed for human judgment. However, this concept is indeterminate and cannot be used to prove anything objective about the object itself, reflecting the unique nature of aesthetic judgment. Quote 111. Aesthetic ideas may be called unexpoundable presentations of the imagination. Kant describes aesthetic ideas as expressions of the imagination that cannot be fully explained or captured by concepts. These ideas provoke thought and reflection, but they resist being neatly defined, embodying the free, imaginative play characteristic of aesthetic experience. Quote 112. Genius can also be explicated as the ability to exhibit aesthetic ideas. This quote defines genius as the capacity to present aesthetic ideas in a way that stimulates the imagination and provokes thought, without being confined by rules or concepts. This creative power allows for the expression of ideas that transcend ordinary understanding, making genius a fundamental aspect of artistic creation. Quote 113. The realistic interpretation of the aesthetic purposiveness of nature finds much support in the beautiful formations in the realm of organized nature, for it certainly seems as if anything beautiful must have been produced on the basis of an idea of it in the producing cause. Kant explains that when we observe beautiful forms in nature, such as flowers or animals, it can seem as though they were intentionally designed to be beautiful, based on some preconceived idea. However, this idea may be misleading, because the beauty we perceive may not necessarily result from any intentional purpose on the part of nature, but rather from the way we interpret and judge these forms. Quote 114. But there is one fact that virtually proves the principle that the purposiveness in the beautiful in nature is ideal, that we ourselves lay this principle at the basis of all our aesthetic judgments, and that it does not permit us to explain natural beauty on the basis of a real purpose pursued by nature for our presentational power. Kant argues that the beauty we perceive in nature is not based on a real, objective purpose intended by nature. Instead, it is a subjective purposiveness that arises from the way we judge and interpret nature. Our minds impose this sense of purpose, and we project beauty onto nature rather than nature creating beauty for us. Quote 115. In fact, however, what counts in judging beauty is not what nature is, nor even what purpose it has for us, but how we receive it. This quote highlights that beauty in nature is not about what nature objectively is or what it might be intended for. The perception of beauty depends entirely on how we, as individuals, experience and judge the natural world. It's a reflection of our subjective reception rather than a fixed attribute of nature itself. Quote 116. If nature had created its forms for our liking, such a purposiveness of nature would always be objective. It would not be a subjective purposiveness based on the play of the imagination in its freedom. Kant points out that if nature's forms were created specifically to please us, then their beauty would be objective, not subjective. However, since beauty is based on the free play of our imagination, it remains a subjective experience, not something that nature intentionally designs for human pleasure. Quote 117. The beautiful is the symbol of the morally good. Kant asserts that beauty serves as a symbol for moral goodness. The way we appreciate beauty, free from personal interest, mirrors the way we should relate to morality. Both involve a kind of universal disinterested judgment that connects our aesthetic sense to higher ethical ideals. Quote 118. The morally good is the intelligible that taste has in view, for it is with this intelligible that even our higher cognitive powers harmonize. Kant explains that when we make judgments of taste, we are, in a way, reaching toward an understanding of moral goodness. This connection between beauty and morality allows our cognitive powers to harmonize, linking our appreciation of beauty with a deeper, rational understanding of ethical principles. Quote 119. Taste enables us, as it were, to make the transition from sensible charm to a habitual moral interest without making too violent a leap. This quote suggests that taste serves as a bridge between the immediate pleasures of sensory experiences and the more profound interest in moral values. It allows us to gradually move from simple aesthetic enjoyment to a deeper engagement with ethical concerns, without creating a harsh divide between these two domains. Quote 120. Transcendental principles do provide us with a good basis for assuming that nature in its particular laws is subjectively purposive for the ability of human judgment. Kant explains that transcendental principles help us understand nature as being organized in a way that aligns with human judgment. This means that, even though nature is not intentionally designed for us, its structure appears to be subjectively suited to our ability to make sense of it and create coherent systems of knowledge from our observations. Quote 121. But the universal idea of nature as the sum total of sense objects gives us no basis whatever for assuming that things of nature serve one another as means to purposes. Kant points out that while we can observe the natural world as a coherent whole, there is no reason to assume that the parts of nature exist to serve specific purposes. Nature does not present itself as having intentionality or as being guided by an overarching goal or purpose, contrary to how some might interpret it. Quote 122. We are saying that nature, considered as mere mechanism, could have structured itself differently in 1,000 ways without hitting on precisely the unity in terms of a principle of purposes. Here, Kant argues that the forms and structures we observe in nature could have been entirely different if they were purely the result of mechanical forces. The unity and complexity that we see in natural systems seem improbable if viewed solely through the lens of mechanical causality, suggesting that nature's arrangement is contingent rather than necessary. Quote 123. Yet we are right to bring teleological judging into our investigation of nature, at least problematically, but only if we do this so as to bring nature under principles of observation and investigation by analogy with the causality in terms of purposes. Kant advises that it is acceptable to use teleological, purpose-based reasoning when examining nature, but only as a way to help structure our investigation. We should not assume that nature operates with intentional purposes, but rather use this approach as a reflective tool to make sense of the complex systems we observe. Quote 124. Hence, teleological judging is reflective, not determinative. This quote underscores Kant's argument that teleological judgment is reflective, meaning that it helps us interpret nature in a way that makes it comprehensible to us, without asserting that nature objectively operates according to purposes. It is a tool for understanding rather than a claim about the nature of reality. Quote 125. If we attributed to nature causes that act intentionally, the concept of a natural purpose would belong no longer to reflective, but to determinative judgment. Kant suggests that if we were to assume that nature operates with intentional causes, we would be shifting from reflective judgment, which helps us interpret, to determinative judgment, which makes objective claims about reality. This would fundamentally change how we understand nature, but Kant cautions against assuming intentionality in nature's operations. Quote 126. The concept of a natural purpose would then introduce a new causality into natural science, even though, in fact, we only borrow this causality from ourselves and attribute it to other beings. Kant warned the concept of natural purposes would impose a new kind of causality into science, one that mirrors human intentionality. However, he argues that this is not a true characteristic of nature, but rather a projection of human reasoning onto the natural world. Quote 127. A circle allows us to solve a multitude of problems that, if we tried to solve them individually, would require considerable apparatus. And this solution, one of the infinitely many splendid properties of this figure, arises spontaneously, as it were. Kant highlights the circle as an example of a geometric figure with inherent purposiveness. Its simple form provides solutions to complex problems without requiring additional tools or external processes, demonstrating how certain natural forms possess an internal utility that serves various intellectual purposes. Quote 128. Plato meant to derive from the pure intuition residing within the human intellect, for there is a necessity in what is purposive, and of such a character that it seems as if it had intentionally been so arranged for our use, while yet it also seems to belong to the original nature of things. Kant refers to Plato's philosophical view that the order and purposiveness in nature can be understood as a reflection of intellectual principles. While it may appear that nature is designed for human use, Plato argued that this purposiveness is inherent to the structure of things, not something imposed externally, suggesting a deeper intellectual connection between human reason and the natural world. Quote 129. This intellectual purposiveness is indeed objective, but we can readily grasp this purposiveness, though only in a universal way, as being merely formal rather than real, that is, as a purposiveness that does not have to be regarded as based on a purpose, and hence does not require teleology. Kant explains that the purposiveness found in objects such as geometric figures is formal rather than real. It serves intellectual purposes, but does not imply that these forms were created with any specific goal in mind. This type of purposiveness, while objective, does not necessitate the assumption of intentional design or teleological explanation. Quote 130. When I draw a figure in accordance with a concept, I introduce the purposiveness into the figure, i.e., into my own way of presenting something that is given to me from outside, whatever it may be in itself. Kant asserts that when we recognize purposiveness in objects, such as geometric figures, it is not something inherent in the objects themselves, but rather something we impose through our intellectual faculties. The act of drawing and conceptualizing introduces purposiveness, highlighting the role of human cognition in shaping how we perceive and understand the world. Quote 131. It is true that we also have no need to know this basis when we are dealing merely with formal purposiveness of our a priori presentations. But even just being forced to look in that direction inspires in us at the same time an admiration for the object that makes us do so. Kant suggests that while we do not need to understand the ultimate basis of formal purposiveness in nature, the mere act of recognizing this purposiveness compels us to admire the object. This admiration stems from the recognition of harmony between our cognitive faculties and the object's form, even if we cannot fully explain it. Quote 132. The diverse rules whose unity arouses this admiration are one and all synthetic, and do not follow from a concept of the object, but require that this object is given in intuition. Kant points out that the unity of diverse rules in certain objects, like geometric figures, evokes admiration because these rules are synthetic. They do not arise from the concept of the object itself. Instead, they require the object to be experienced directly through intuition, further demonstrating the interplay between form, reason, and perception. Quote 133. Instead of calling such a property of a mathematical figure its beauty, it would be better to call it the figure's relative perfection. Kant distinguishes between beauty and perfection in mathematical figures. While some might refer to the purposive qualities of geometric forms as beautiful, Kant argues that these qualities are better described as perfection because they are objective and relate to the form's ability to serve various intellectual purposes, rather than invoking subjective aesthetic pleasure. Quote 134. Now, in order for a thing to be a natural purpose, it must meet two requirements. First, the possibility of its parts, as concerns both their existence and their form, must depend on their relation to the whole. Kant explains that for something to be considered a natural purpose, its individual parts must exist in relation to the whole. The form and existence of the parts cannot be understood separately from the larger system they are part of, highlighting the interconnectedness of the whole and its parts in natural purposes. Quote 135. The parts of the thing combine into the unity of a whole because they are reciprocally cause and effect of their form. This quote emphasizes that in a natural purpose, the parts not only form the whole, but also mutually influence one another. Each part is both a cause and an effect of the others, creating a dynamic interdependence that defines the organization of the whole, a quality that distinguishes natural purposes from artificial constructions. Quote 136. Therefore, in order for us to judge a body as being, in itself and in its inner possibility, a natural purpose, what is needed is that all its parts, through their own causality, produce one another as regards both their form and combination. Kant asserts that to consider something a natural purpose, its parts must not only contribute to the whole, but must also produce and sustain each other. This self-sustaining quality is essential to natural purposes as it reflects the internal causality that defines living organisms and organized systems in nature. Quote 137. An organized being is not a mere machine, for a machine has only motive force, but an organized being has within it formative force, and a formative force that this being imparts to the kinds of matter that lack it. Kant distinguishes between machines and organized beings by noting that machines rely on external forces for movement, while organized beings possess an internal formative force. This force allows them to shape and organize matter in a way that machines cannot, reflecting the self-organizing and self-sustaining nature of living organisms. Quote 138. Nature organizes itself, and it does so within each species of its organized products. For though the pattern that nature follows is the same overall, that pattern also includes deviations useful for self-preservation as required by circumstances. Kant observes that nature's organization follows consistent patterns across species, but also allows for deviations that serve the purpose of self-preservation. This adaptability within the framework of natural laws highlights the ability of living organisms to respond to changing conditions while maintaining their overall structure and purpose. Quote 139. Hence, organized beings are the only beings in nature that, even when considered by themselves, and apart from any relation to other things, must still be thought of as possible only as purposes of nature. This quote underscores that organized beings, living organisms, are unique in nature because they are self-sufficient and must be understood as natural purposes in and of themselves. Unlike other natural objects, their existence cannot be fully explained without reference to their internal purpose and organization. Quote 140. An organized product of nature is one in which everything is a purpose, and reciprocally also a means. Kant defines an organized being as one in which every part serves both as a purpose and as a means to maintain the whole. This reciprocal relationship between parts and the whole is a defining characteristic of natural organisms, making them distinct from mechanical objects, where parts serve only as means to an external purpose. Quote 141. When judgment reflects, it has to subsume under a law that is not yet given, and hence must subsume under a law that is in fact only a principle of reflection on certain objects for which we have no objective law at all, no concept of the object adequate as a principle for the cases that occur. Kant explains that reflective judgment operates when no objective law or concept exists for particular objects. In these situations, judgment must create its own guiding principle to reflect on the objects. This subjective principle helps organize and understand things for which there is no pre-existing, determined rule or law. Quote 142. The first maxim of judgment is this thesis: all production of material things and their forms must be judged to be possible in terms of merely mechanical laws. This quote presents the first maxim of reflective judgment, which holds that all material things and their forms should be understood as products of mechanical laws. This perspective seeks to explain natural phenomena solely through physical causality and mechanisms. Quote 143. The second maxim is this antithesis: some products of material nature cannot be judged to be possible in terms of merely mechanical laws. Kant contrasts the first maxim with this second one, which asserts that not all natural products can be explained through mechanical laws alone. Certain complex forms in nature require the additional concept of final causes or purposes, suggesting that some natural phenomena cannot be fully understood through mechanical means. Quote 144. Hence, all semblance of an antinomy between the maxims of strictly physical, mechanical, and teleological, technical explanation rests on our confusing a principle of reflective judgment with one of determinative judgment. Kant clarifies that the apparent conflict between mechanical and teleological explanations stems from a misunderstanding. The antinomy occurs because people confuse the reflective use of judgment, which is subjective and exploratory, with the determinative use, which applies objective principles. Once this distinction is recognized, the conflict disappears. Quote 145. For if we settle for speculating within the bounds of mere cognition of nature, the above maxims are sufficient for us to study nature to the extent of our human powers and to probe its most hidden secrets. Kant suggests that the two maxims, mechanical and teleological, are sufficient for investigating nature within the limits of human understanding. These maxims allow us to explore and reflect on nature's complexities without making definitive, objective claims about the ultimate causes or purposes behind natural phenomena. Quote 146. As for the realistic interpretation of natural purposes, there are those who not only assert this realism, but also think they are explaining it. They believe they have insight into at least the possibility of a special kind of causality, the kind found in causes that act intentionally. This quote describes the realistic approach to natural purposes, which asserts that certain natural phenomena are products of intentional causality. Advocates of this view believe they can explain the existence of natural purposes by positing an intelligent cause that acts with intention, rather than relying solely on mechanical laws. Quote 147. That leaves theism. It too cannot dogmatically provide a basis that accounts for the possibility of natural purposes, and so provide a key to teleology. But it does have one advantage over all other bases to explain these purposes, viz., theism is best able to rescue the purposiveness of nature from idealism. Kant discusses theistic explanations for natural purposes, acknowledging that while theism cannot definitively explain natural purposes, it has an advantage over other views. Theism introduces an intelligent cause, which helps preserve the idea of intentionality in nature, offering a more plausible account than purely idealistic interpretations. Quote 148. Now the concept of a thing as a natural purpose is one that subsumes nature under a causality that is conceivable only as exercised by reason. Kant emphasizes that the idea of a natural purpose requires us to think of nature as being governed by a type of causality that can only be understood through reason. This concept goes beyond mechanical explanations, suggesting that we must use reason to grasp how nature might operate under principles of intentional design or purpose. Quote 149. For reason is quite unable to prove the concept of a natural purpose, i.e., that it has objective reality. This quote underlines that reason cannot provide definitive proof that natural purposes exist in an objective sense. While we may reflect on nature and its apparent purposiveness, we cannot establish this concept as a concrete reality. It remains a subjective tool for understanding rather than an objective truth about nature. Quote 150. Hence the concept of a thing as a natural purpose is determinative judgment if we consider the object through reason. Kant explains that the concept of natural purposes is transcendent when applied to determinative judgment, meaning it goes beyond what we can know empirically. While we can reflect on the idea of a natural purpose, it cannot be fully grasped or proven through objective reasoning, as it exceeds the limits of our understanding. Quote 151. The concept of a causality through purposes does indeed have objective reality, as does also the concept of a causality in terms of the mechanism of nature. Here, Kant acknowledges that the concepts of causality through purposes and the mechanism of nature both have objective reality. However, he points out that the concept of natural causality based on purposes cannot be fully justified or explained, as it involves a kind of reasoning that goes beyond empirical observation. Quote 152. But the concept of a natural causality in terms of the rule of purposes is nevertheless inadequate for making dogmatic determinations. Kant clarifies that while we can think of nature as following a rule of purposes, this concept is insufficient for making definitive, dogmatic claims. The limitations of human reason prevent us from fully understanding or proving that nature operates with intentionality, meaning we cannot use this idea to make concrete judgments about the world. Quote 153. We are absolutely unable to form a concept of how such a world is possible, except by thinking of it as brought about by a supreme cause that acts intentionally. Kant argues that, given the limitations of our cognitive powers, we cannot comprehend the possibility of the world's complexity without invoking the idea of a supreme cause that acts with intention. This cause, while not provable, provides a framework for making sense of the purposiveness we perceive in nature. Quote 154. It is quite certain that in terms of merely mechanical principles of nature, we cannot even adequately become familiar with, much less explain, organized beings and how they are internally possible. Kant stresses that mechanical principles alone are insufficient to explain the existence and organization of living beings. The complexity and purposiveness seen in nature require a different kind of explanation, one that cannot be fully captured by the laws of physics or mechanics. Quote 155. The idea in question is a principle of reason for the power of judgment, not for the understanding. Hence, it is a principle that helps us merely to apply understanding generally to possible objects of experience, namely, in those cases where we cannot judge determinatively but can judge merely reflectively. Kant explains that when we cannot make a determinate judgment about certain objects, we use a principle of reason that helps us reflect on those objects. This principle does not provide understanding in a strict sense, but aids in applying reason to objects that we encounter in experience when definitive knowledge is not possible. Quote 156. Our understanding, on the other hand, requires this contingency, because it must start from the parts taken as bases, which are thought of as universal, for different possible forms that are to be subsumed under these bases. Kant points out that human understanding must work from the parts to the whole, deriving forms from the particulars that serve as a basis for general concepts. This process reflects the contingent nature of our understanding, which differs from an intuitive understanding that might start with the whole and proceed to the parts. Quote 157. But the product of a cause that determines its effect merely on the basis of the presentation of that effect is called a purpose. Here, Kant defines a purpose as the result of a cause that acts with the intention of producing a specific effect. This notion of causality involves a forward-thinking process where the effect is already conceived by the cause, marking it as distinct from mechanical causality, which does not involve intentional design. Quote 158. The fact that we present certain products of nature as possible only in terms of a kind of causality that differs from the causality of the natural laws pertaining to matter, namely the causality of purposes and final causes, is merely a consequence of the special character of our understanding. Kant explains that the reason we interpret certain natural products as being possible only through purposeful causality, rather than mechanical laws, is due to the nature of our understanding. Our cognitive faculties lead us to impose purposiveness onto nature, even though this may not be an inherent quality of nature itself. Quote 159. For we are assured that it is at least possible that objectively, too, both these principles might be reconcilable in one principle, since they concern appearances, which presuppose a supersensible basis. Kant suggests that while mechanical and teleological principles appear to be distinct, they may be reconcilable under a higher, supersensible principle. This implies that the two ways of understanding nature could, in theory, be united at a deeper, unknowable level of reality, beyond human cognition. Quote 160. Hence, we also do not know how far we may get with the mechanical kind of explanation that is possible for us. Only this much is certain. No matter how far it will take us, yet it must always be inadequate for things that we have once recognized as natural purposes. Kant acknowledges the limits of mechanical explanations. While we can extend mechanical reasoning to many natural phenomena, it will never be sufficient to explain things that we recognize as natural purposes. For such phenomena, we must eventually turn to teleological principles to account for their purposiveness. Quote 161. Because of this, we are authorized to adopt the following procedure. We are to explain all products and events of nature, even the most purposive ones, in mechanical terms as far as we possibly can. Yet, in doing so, we are never to lose sight of the fact that we must ultimately subordinate such products to the causality in terms of purposes. Kant advocates a balanced approach, where we seek mechanical explanations for natural phenomena as far as possible, but must recognize when mechanical causality fails. In such cases, we must resort to teleological explanations, acknowledging that our understanding is limited and must account for purposes in nature. Critique of Judgment by Immanuel Kant ultimately provides a cohesive understanding of human experience and teleology as critiques. The exploration of beauty and the sublime reflects the harmony between human faculties and nature, while teleological reflection on purpose addresses the unity between freedom and necessity. Kant positions reflective judgment as a mediator that reconciles the realms of the natural and the moral. By doing so, he not only completes his critical system, but also enriches our understanding of how subjective and objective dimensions of human existence can converge, revealing deeper insights into both art and the natural world.
Curious to dive into the mind of Immanuel Kant? With Study Lab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of critique of judgment in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.